Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Resurgence of Psychedelic Research, Implication for Prevention and Education. My name is Clay Anderson, one of the graduate assistants at IHEC, and I'll be your moderator. I'm assisting Madison, the Assistant Director for the Illinois Higher Education Center for Alcohol, Other Drug, and Violence Prevention, and we are very excited to be hosting today's event. Before I hand over the microphone, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about today's webinar and the GoToWebinar platform. For those of you new to using GoToWebinar, you will see the control panel on the right of your screen. This is where you will find the question box that you can type and submit to at the end of the presentation. All attendees will be muted for today's program, but that doesn't mean you can't still participate. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Matt Vogel.
All right. Thanks, Clay. I appreciate it. It's good to be here with you all. You're in Illinois. That is my birthplace. I was born in Peru, Illinois, and but I live in Oregon now. I've lived on the West Coast. I was back in the Midwest for a while, and now I've been back on the West Coast for about 10 years. In Southern Oregon, I live in Ashland. Yeah, so I worked for many years as a health promotion specialist, health educator in the college environment, and also an instructor. So I taught in the psychology department, also in our health ed department. I still do some teaching, but decided in 2018 I was doing a lot of independent work and consulting work, and decided to leave my full-time job there and just continue to adjunct and continue to present and work in a lot of different fields and arenas, and extend out into doing some more adult learning and consulting, etc. So it's been really fun. But I was in person with some of you probably a couple years ago. I did a full day seminar with IHEC, and it was really nice. And I was contacted and just thought, hey, what's a topic you'd be interested to talk about? And I said this one on psychedelics, because I've been presenting on this topic on and off for, gosh, probably over 10 years. And I think it's a fascinating one. I think there are real implications around this for the work that we do. And also, I think that there's maybe implications for the larger society at this time, and it's gained a lot of popularity and a lot of interest. Two disclaimers I want to put out. Three disclaimers. One, there is a rooster that is being very loud right now, so hopefully that doesn't bother you and you can't hear it. Two, we adopted another dog a couple months ago, and sometimes he gets a little bored and nervous and might come in here, and hopefully he won't bark. And the third thing, I'm a really interactive presenter. I like to have a lot of conversation when I present and get ideas from you and share and all those things. So I know it's a little bit limited on the format we're at now, but I really would encourage you at any time to either chat in or comment in the question box. If you want to comment in anything or ask a question midstream, I will pause at times to allow space for that. And Clay, feel free to hop in, interrupt me anytime if that's happening, if there's a question about something. But I'll try as much as I can to pause at a couple different points and have as much interaction as we can in this format, if that works for you. So great. So let's get started. There's a couple things right away that I want to just mention that I probably won't get into too much today, but I want to discuss two substances right off the bat. And I don't know if you've heard of these or not, but they are somewhat popular, but there's not too much research going on with them, but they are popular, and it's a good warm up to talk about psychedelics in general. They're both a form of DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. And the one with the toad, this is a real thing. This is you probably hear in the folklore about people licking toads and getting high from that. This is somewhat true, somewhat not. But on this toad called the Bufo alvarius toad, there's glands on it, and people milk the glands. And then it's like kind of a milky substance. You have to dry that. It gets dried into a powder, and then people smoke that. And it is a drug called 5-methoxy dimethyltryptamine, or 5-MeO-DMT. And it's an incredibly fast-acting, rapid psychedelic. And as you know, a lot of you work in the field of prevention or substance use. You probably present on something called route of administration. How a substance goes into the body really impacts how that substance shows up. So if someone smokes a drug or injects it directly intravenously, that is a very fast way for a drug to enter the body. If someone snorts a drug, it also enters somewhat quickly, but not as quickly as smoking or intravenous. Intramuscular is a little bit slower than obviously eating something, swallowing something is a slower route of administration. So this is really interesting with 5-MeO-DMT. It's gotten popular actually, where to the point where these toads are getting a little bit extinct in some areas of Mexico, where they are in their natural habitat. People are harvesting them and taking them and really over milking them and harming their health. It's really interesting. But it's gotten popular in underground circles where people will self-proclaim themselves to be a shaman or a healer and then do kind of a session with someone where they'll smoke 5-MeO-DMT and then try to work through interpersonal issues or what have you. But it's very intense, and it's different than sometimes the application that we're seeing in a more therapeutic research protocol in some of the studies that I'll talk about today. But I did want to mention that if you ever, in part of this today, I really hope a goal can be that if students come to talk to you about this or it comes up, because it's definitely out there in pop culture now, way more than it ever has been. If it comes up, you have some general understanding of some of these things. So this is part of this session as well. Now, the other form of DMT, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, is found in a lot of foods. And we actually ingest this quite a bit in different foods that we eat, different plants that we eat. But we have an enzyme in our body called monoamine oxidase, or MAO, and that very quickly breaks down N,N-DMT. But when you combine some of the, there's a plant that has a natural MAO inhibitor inside of it. And so when you combine a couple plants together, one of them has a lot of DMT, the other one has a natural MAO inhibitor, then the DMT can really kind of quote unquote work, and people have a very strong psychedelic experience. And that is usually brewed into a traditional brew called ayahuasca. And so this picture you see, those are the plants that are blended together to make this tea called ayahuasca. And this has also gotten very popular, where you have sort of like Hollywood types going down to Peru or other parts of South America and doing an ayahuasca ceremony. And there's a little bit of research being done with ayahuasca right now in Canada, seeing if it can help people with addiction, specifically alcohol addiction. Sometimes there are some mechanism within psychedelics that can be somewhat addiction interrupting. So there's a little bit of actual research going on with that one, but I just wanted to mention that as well. If you haven't heard of that one has gotten very popular kind of in pop culture, to the point where there's, documentaries about it and stuff like that. So I just want to give that distinction and warm up by talking about these, and that these are two different types of dimethyltryptamine that we're not going to get into with a ton of detail, but I wanted to mention it to start us off. And then a couple of things I always talk about in any presentation I give is our confirmation bias, right? We all like things that support our opinions. We like to seek out political views or social views or other things like that that really support us. I always ask students, especially my cannabis loving students, hey, can you kind of suspend your pre-existing bias a little bit so that we can have a rational, pragmatic conversation about this? And sometimes I know that really influences people. It's something really good to unpack, I think, with students, because they kind of hold on to a lot of confirmation bias, especially related to substances. And you'll find that, right? I'm sure some of you have students who are really into cannabis. They probably know more about it than some of us, and it's intimidating, and they cannot hear anything that could question their narrative around it, that maybe it's not perfect for them all the time. So I just want to mention that. Sometimes I think it's a great kind of topic to discuss. I always give a little drug history just for fun. We had Nancy Reagan, very well intended in 1986, talking about just say no, and it kind of oversimplified, as we know now, as a very complex topic. I really like kind of the just say no, let's have knowledge, let's empower people, etc. And if you were with me in person a couple years ago, some of these first 5 slides are going to be familiar to you. And we just look back at history, right? We had cocaine toothache drops. At the time, we didn't really understand that this could potentially be a problem. giving cocaine to children, but we were, right, and we just didn't quite understand things. I know that in modern day we often think we know more, and so we get recency bias, but sometimes we don't. I'm sure there's things we're doing now that in 100 years we're going to be like, what were we doing? What are we thinking? So here we are. We have, if you can see kind of in the middle there, it says heroin, the sedative for coughs. This was produced by Bayer Pharmaceutical Products. Very common to get to that. Heroin was legal and given out for coughs. It worked for that, and it did a lot of other things too. So, but that's something in our history, right? We have for children's teething, we have Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup with the main ingredient was morphine. Again, prior to 1906, nothing had to be labeled, so we could sell medicine without a label on it, so you wouldn't maybe know that you're giving your kid morphine. Here's heroin, again, in a tincture form, cannabis tincture, and then heroin in the liquid vial. I don't know if you knew this, but a lot of liquor that was consumed during Prohibition was medical liquor. It was prescribed by a doctor. I don't know. This is this weird little secret during Prohibition, but the U.S. Treasury Department issued out, they had, you could get a pad and you could issue a prescription for medical liquor, kind of similar to like medical cannabis like we see now. And then, and lastly, this is an interesting one. Methamphetamine was prescribed pretty widely in the 1950s. Amphetamine was as well, but methamphetamine was as well for depression, obesity, etc. So it's interesting, right? These things in our past that we've looked at, which are kind of strange. We don't really, maybe understand what was going on at the time. And I think that's why psychedelics are somewhat interesting as well, because they have an interesting history and kind of lore to them that I think gets a lot of students kind of interested. Just a heads up, whenever I switch topics, I'll put a beautiful picture in there. This is Bear Lake in Northern California, the Trinity Alps. It's about a 6-mile hike on a hot day in the summer, and then you jump in that lake, and boy, is it cold and amazing. So if you ever want to go, there you go. Okay. So real quick, let's talk psychedelics. Now, they have become more popular. You hear more and more students talking about them for sure, and just people in pop culture. There's tons of clinical trials that are going on and being conducted that the federal government is approving, and a lot more pop cultural media attention. And one of the areas that's gotten a lot of attention is microdosing, this concept that you take a small amount of a drug, usually like LSD or psilocybin mushrooms, just enough that it's not going to have a psychoactive effect, but it might have a subtle effect. And there's people who are really kind of proponents of this in saying that it can help with depression and kind of other maybe health ailments, but it's definitely gotten popular. So we can see some images from culture here, right? Just there's a book on microdosing. You can see on the top middle it says The Mind Explained. That's a series on Netflix. There is a 5-part series called The Mind, and one of those 5 was about psychedelics. That Have a Good Trip, Adventures in Psychedelics, is also a documentary on Netflix, which is all comedians talking about their experiences with psychedelics. Yeah, there's the Yale has a psychedelics group. That's their crest there in the middle. You can see the Y. There's a psychedelic group, a little wing associated with their medical school. You can see Sanjay Gupta there on the bottom right, talking about psychedelics, controversial drugs like ecstasy and LSD getting a second look. So discussing this in a more pop culture way. You have Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. There's a researcher there who was one of the really primary people who started some of the psychedelic research in the late 2000s with psilocybin. And then Imperial College of London Center for Psychedelic Research. And then on the top left, the last thing I want to mention, Michael Pollan, right? So Clay, you probably know him. He writes a lot of books about food. Most of his past writing was about nutrition and food systems and sustainability, sustainable agriculture and food systems. But he got real interested in psychedelics a couple of years ago and wrote this book, How to Change Your Mind. And what was really interesting is I have friends who are therapists who said in the past couple years, they have had more people than they've ever in the previous 20 years approach them and say, hey, would you be willing to facilitate a kind of day-long therapy session with me where I take a psychedelic. And they would say, well, I can't because this isn't a legal clinical trial and I don't have the right to do that. But where's this coming from? What got you interested? And they said, well, I read Michael Pollan's book. And so um, someone joked with me and said people are getting pollinated by this book, and that it's getting people kind of a little more curious and interested in this topic. So there's something going on, right? There's this kind of confluence of the research that's happening along with pop culture that has got some people a little bit more interested in this topic and what's happening here. So again, there's a lot to this, and there's aspects to it that we'll get into as well. So a couple just notes on psychedelics. It's tough to pin down what the experience is like because it varies so much. And one of the biggest predictors of this is what's called set and setting. And this goes back, this was discussed in the 60s and 70s. The set is your mindset that you're in going into an experience, and the setting is the environment that you're in. So if you're in a high stress environment, you are more likely to have an adverse reaction to a psychedelic. If you're in an environment you're comfortable, the setting is not only the physical environment, but the people you're with, the time of day, all of these things, all of that, right? And the mindset is your expectation. Do you have any family dynamics that are going on right now? That may be causing challenge for you. All of those things really shape the experience. So when over the years, my students would be very comfortable with me generally and would talk about some experiences they were having, whether it be with cannabis edibles or a psychedelic. And when you really would get into it, when people would have an adverse reaction to a substance, it's often when you really drill down into what was going on, where were you? Oh, I was at like a huge concert and I get really anxious in big crowds. So then I like kind of freaked out. I don't know, I took LSD with my friends and then panicked and had to like go to the hospital, right? That kind of thing. So the environment can play a great role with this. So the environment has definitely been a part of the discussion of the research currently. So when people are doing the research protocols, like at Johns Hopkins or UCLA or NYU, wherever this is, they UW-Madison, right? They are very aware of what's the physical space in the room going to be like when we're doing a clinical trial. Psychedelics are what we could call the kind of least abused drugs. They're that you don't hear too much about someone like, using psilocybin mushrooms or LSD or something like this in the same way that we hear with opioids or heavy stimulants like methylphenidate or Adderall or methamphetamine, whatever, or cathinones. You just don't hear about it in the same way. So it's often people will often report, yeah, I took something and I had no desire to take something for 3 months or something to that effect. And there's a lot with family history, mental illness, et cetera, that it's important that there is a lot of screening that's going on in the clinical trials and making sure really trying to understand that before someone would be in the clinical trial, even though sometimes they're working with a mental health challenge someone's having, but they're trying to understand the severity and levels of that within the research. So here's a quick thing. I'll go through this slide and then I'll pause. A few challenges that I think are happening with the psychedelic world. There can be a dogmatism to it where people can feel that this is the answer for every person at every time, or maybe they had a specific experience that was powerful and positive, and so therefore they're applying that to everyone across the board. And as we know, in the world of health and wellness, there is no one size fits all for anything. But there can be a clear dogmatism that almost really can hinge on a sort of radical kind of I guess religiosity kind of dynamic around this that I've definitely found within kind of different circles and communities. I think what's been interesting for me, I've been able to present on this topic at very conventional settings, like the Higher Ed Center National Meeting, the NASPA National Meeting, and then I've discussed this topic in more unconventional settings. A friend of mine conducted a psychedelic conference, and I did a little presentation there on some of the challenges that actually are in the world of psychedelics, and it was met with like kind of lukewarm response, but because some people didn't want to hear that, right? So I've been able to have discussions with people in all different realms around this, and I feel like it's been good for me. And within that dogmatism, there can be an unwillingness to be critical, to be able to be critical thinkers and just think about, well, where could this go wrong, and not just what could maybe be beneficial about this, but what are some challenges potentially? And I think that's a high form of critical thinking, to be able to critique things that we like or appreciate. This is one of the biggest things that I think I'm worried about, is untrained people facilitating sessions with others. So someone may, again, kind of self-proclaim that they are a healer in some regard, or a shaman, and then they are conducting sessions with people, but they don't have any background in mental health, in psychology, etc. And often the answer is, if someone's having a difficult experience with a psychedelic, to just go deeper and take more medicine. That's kind of sometimes the answer, and there's real risk with that for sure. Um, um, I think reading headlines with very little understanding of research protocols is a big one. I had a student many years ago say, "Hey, I heard that MDMA was good for post-traumatic stress disorder." I was like, and so I'm kind of curious to try this, sometime just at like a party or something. I'm like, oh, well, in the research, they're not going to parties. It's very supervised. It's also, the purity of the drug is very known. It's synthesized in a Schedule 1 lab that's approved by the federal government. Those are all different things that are not happening at your party on Friday night. So please keep that in mind. And that's some of the biggest kind of issues that I sort of see with it. And then I'm going to kind of talk about some of the research dynamics, but I want to pause here and see if anyone has any questions or comments. And Clay, I think you'll have to mediate that for me if there are.
Okay, yeah, it doesn't look like there's any at the moment, but yeah, if anyone wants to send any questions real quick, feel free.
All right, sounds good. You just hop in anytime, Clay, let me know.
Alrighty.
See, I can't make eye contact with you, I don't know. Okay, great. So let's talk about the research a little bit. So there are some contraindications, like if people have a cardiovascular health challenge, there's other contraindications that are there around this, right? So if someone's taking a monoamine oxidase inhibiting antidepressant, they would have to essentially detox from taking that before, say, entering a clinical trial with MDMA. It's a very, very dangerous combination. Monoamine oxidase inhibiting antidepressant, really, we need monoamine oxidase to help break down the release of excessive serotonin when someone takes MDMA. And when that is diminished, that ability is diminished, it can cause serotonin syndrome, and people can actually be paralyzed or die from that combination. So there are contraindications that for every clinical trial are discussed. Like I said, set and setting is very much a part of these now. Funding, let's talk about that in a moment. How does this happen if it's Schedule 1? I will discuss that in detail in a moment as well. And there really is not much interest from the pharmaceutical industry yet in this protocol. Most of the funding, most of the studies are conducted through nonprofit agencies that help facilitate and support, but then and provide guidance, whether it be at a university or not. But there just hasn't really been too much buy-in from pharmaceutical industry on this yet. So here's something on funding. I think this was really interesting. There's a press release, right? This is a psychedelic research fundraising campaign attracts 30 million in donations in 6 months. They're really the closest drug I think we'll have to being FDA approved and moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 is MDMA. That is on track to probably happen in the year 2022, so next year. This research campaign was started by Tim Ferriss. I don't know if you know him. He's a podcaster and kind of an investor, Silicon Valley guy, author, interesting guy, but he started this. He got 5 people, I believe, including himself, to donate $1 million each. And then they got matching funds. If they could get more money raised, then they'd all donate another $1 million and yada yada. So anyway, that's a lot, right? $30 million. And they worked with an organization called MAPS. And that is this one on the right, multidisciplinary. Oh, that's kind of blurry. Sorry, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. If you went to that website, maps.org, you will find everything you need to know about psychedelic research going on. They are very involved with almost every aspect of psychedelic research currently in the US. The Hefter Research Institute is another one that helps provide guidance and support and some funding, because both of these organizations will fundraise. Like right now, you could go online and donate $10 to MAPS and it will go toward research project. And Hefter is another one. They're kind of do a lot of work in different European countries and in the US as well. But I would say MAPS is probably the most well-known, I'd say it's a 501c3 in the world around psychedelic research. They put on the Psychedelic Science Conference every year. And this has been around for a long time. It was started by someone named Rick Doblin. He's really well known in the world of psychedelics as well. So again, if this piques your interest and you're curious to learn more, if students ask you questions and you need to kind of get a little bit more information, maps.org is pretty fascinating site for you. And then this question I asked, how does this happen if it's Schedule 1? Well, as you probably all of you know, there's 5 federal schedules, Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. Schedule 1 drugs are categorized by the federal government to have a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. Schedule 2 drugs are thought to have a high potential for abuse as well, but have some accepted medical use. And you can put any restriction you want on Schedule 2 drugs. Schedule 3 drugs are thought to have some potential for abuse, maybe not as much as the other ones in Schedule 2, Schedule 4, Schedule 5, and it's kind of goes down in severity in that way. Now, anyone who really studies pharmacology and looks at these lists, Schedule 1 through 5, like a lot of the benzodiazepines are Schedule 4. And if you talk to someone who's in recovery from benzodiazepine addiction, they'll tell you, I don't know about that. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag of science and politics. Again, that is my opinion and thought on it. But again, you can put restrictions on this. So you can see that Schedule 2, cocaine is Schedule 2. You cannot go to Walgreens and get a prescription filled for cocaine, but they leave it in Schedule 2, and just because it does have some accepted medical use as something that can be used as a local anesthetic for a like ear, nose, or throat surgery if they need it. You can see amphetamine is Schedule 2. That is Adderall, right? So the restriction on that, you cannot go get a year's supply of Adderall, right? There's a restriction, I believe it's 30 or 60 days at the most that you can get for that. I believe 30, and you have to have a prescription with you when you get it refilled. Methylphenidate, that's Ritalin, etc. So you can see the distinction there between Schedule 2. You can put a restriction on it. So Schedule 1 drugs are thought to have no medical use, high potential for abuse, never to be used by anyone. So you can see on there psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA or ecstasy, cannabis, heroin, LSD, dimethyltryptamine, etc. There's many, many more in there, ibogaine. Schedule 1 drugs, if they are to be researched, so if someone wants to do a clinical trial with a Schedule 1 drug, they have to get approval from the FDA from the DEA. The FDA has to approve it and the DEA has to approve it. So the DEA has to have some oversight and know what you're doing. And if I was conducting a clinical trial where I'm physically giving someone LSD, I have to have a special permit, a Schedule 1 permit, that I can have that in my possession and not get arrested. Additionally, where I can't go out to someone downtown where I live and be like, hey bro, I'm doing this study, do you have any LSD I can buy off you? It doesn't work that way. I have to get it from a pre-approved Schedule 1 lab where that has been very closely researched, purity is in check, etc. So there's a few of those labs. There's one at Purdue University, there's one at University of Wisconsin in Madison, where they are synthesizing MDMA, and actually they're used for the psilocybin studies. They're using a synthetic psilocybin and not the actual mushrooms. So that's kind of how that can happen. Just if you're wondering, well, how does this happen? How are these clinical trials being conducted and done? Well, there's clear oversight, and there's definitely like eyeballs on these studies. Okay, so here's a couple of the areas of research, and then I'll drill down further into the MDMA one because I think that's one of the more interesting ones. Addiction, I just put this one study on here about ibogaine, but there is a lot of research about addiction and the use of psychedelics related to them. Ibogaine is a drug that comes from Africa and parts of West Africa. There's a plant called the iboga plant, and the just like the tobacco plant, the psychoactive compound is nicotine. Just like the cannabis plant, the psychoactive compound is THC. In the iboga plant, the psychoactive compound is ibogaine hydrochloride, and that can be extracted from the plant, and it's a very strong psychedelic. Often a regular dose, it lasts about 25 to 35 hours. It is generally unpleasant, but something about it has been found to have a little bit of an addiction interrupting process. There's someone at University of Miami who's been studying this, Deborah Mash. There's other people interested in this. There's been a little hesitancy because of how potent it is and how intense the experience can be. And there is contraindications if you have cardiovascular problems. And someone died in one of the studies because or in one of the clinics, not a study, but a clinic, an underground clinic, because he showed up intoxicated on alcohol, and then taking this, he passed away. So there is a little bit, there's clear hesitancy on this one. So there are underground ibogaine clinics in the United States that are very much kind of on the down low, but there's actual above board legal clinics in Mexico, Canada, Netherlands, and there's people who talk about this in the opioid world who say, yep, I took this drug and I had no cravings for opioid. I took opioids every day for 10 years. I took one session of this. I had no cravings for the drug for 2 months and had no withdrawals. So there's some sort of agonist effect on one of the opioid. It's a little confusing, actually. People don't really understand what are the neuropharmacological impacts of this, whether it's something acting on the kappa opioid receptors or the delta receptors. It's uncertain, but nonetheless, it's interesting that the field of addiction is being looked at in this way. I would also, if you're curious, we don't have time to get into it, there was a ton of studies done with addiction in the 1950s with alcohol and LSD. And one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, said that he did not truly quit alcohol until he had a LSD assisted psychotherapy session, a very long, multi-hour session where he could get into the underlying reasons why he was drinking and understand that. And when he was able to go through that process, he felt that he truly quit and wanted that written in the bylaws of AA, that psychedelic therapy could be a part of that. So this was not new. This has gone on for a long time. There was, I think it was Humphrey Osmond was the name of the researcher. He did a ton of research in the 1950s, actually with a great deal of success. Numbers that we've really never seen before in terms of people exiting away from alcohol. Fascinating, right? So it's, again, there's something there potentially, but how is it done? I don't know. People are looking at, there's definitely been an interest in looking at how can we make a compound similar to ibogaine, but that doesn't have the psychoactive effects. And then others who advocate this say, well, the psychoactive effects are what is the kind of medicine that by taking that away, you're taking away the experience and it's not going to have the same effect. Again, I don't know that, but I that's kind of the argument. The other big area is around anxiety related to the end of life. So if someone's given an advanced stage cancer diagnosis or you have 12 months to live kind of thing, there's a lot of studies related to this that have gone on. This is one of the first ones in 2006 at UCLA, and they found very positive results from this, right? They found that could be safe. They took this one time. It wasn't like they were taking it. You can't take a psychedelic every day like psilocybin, right? It doesn't. You would have an immediate acute tolerance. So if I took psilocybin today and then tried to take it again tomorrow, I really wouldn't feel anything tomorrow. There's an acute tolerance that builds. So Generally when these are done, you take in one time and then maybe again 6 months later or a year later, but this one was a one-time deal. But they found safety with it, and they found that it actually had a positive effect, that people, it reduced anxiety related to their diagnosis. Another one related to this was Johns Hopkins Medical School. Um, so this one definitely got a lot of attention. The primary researcher was, his name is Roland Griffiths, and I was at a conference in 2009 and got to hear him speak about this study and the how it was conducted. Again, smaller sample size, 36 patients. You can kind of, sorry, this is a lot of words on this slide. I'm happy to share these slides, by the way. I don't know if Clay, if that's a way to do that and get it to people, but I could send it as a PDF. But they found generally that people found this experience to be quite positive. Let me see. I gotta move my little. There we go. Then I can read my slide here. So what's interesting about it too, at 14 months after, if you can see that third bullet point there, it said that there was, 1 month after the session at the 2 highest doses, volunteers rated the psilocybin experience as having substantial personal spiritual significance and attributed to the experience sustained positive changes in attitude, mood, behavior, with the ascending dose sequence showing greater positive effects. At 14 months, readings were undiminished and were consistent. So that's what kind of got people's attention with this study was, okay, 14 months later, it still was having this positive effect for people, those that were still alive. And so what does that mean? Like, is this a way that this should, how do we, is this something that should be implemented? Is this, we often talk about things being evidence-based. Is this evidence? I don't know, right? Do we need obviously more studies to replicate this? But it was an interesting kind of key study to look at, okay, there is a safety profile there, et cetera. Now, what I would say with this, they're using synthetic psilocybin, and there was another study done at UW-Madison, same thing. They use synthetic psilocybin. I don't know if we can fully take that and apply it to someone eating mushrooms, because mushrooms have other compounds in them like baeocystin and psilocin and other micro compounds in them that work in a synergistic effect with one another. Whereas when you take something singularly, like if you pull THC out of the cannabis plant and take it alone, it has a different effect than if it's mixed in with the other cannabinoids. So there's some debate in this research world about this a little bit. Do these studies where they are using synthetic psilocybin, does it really relate, and can it translate to a whole plant kind of approach with psilocybin mushrooms? Now, in my state of Oregon, there was a law just passed with this last election that psilocybin is going to be the actual mushrooms, not synthetic, are going to be legal for therapeutic use. It is not, there's a committee set up. They have about 1.5 to 2 years to figure out the rules for that. They haven't figured it out yet, obviously. It just happened. So it will be interesting to see what this actually looks like. One of the big challenges is how do you standardize something that is grown naturally like that? How do you really know exactly, how do you replicate it and know exactly what you're getting? And then the other one was about and at NYU, they did the same thing, very similar study to the Hopkins study. They used a lot of the same methodology, but found same thing, that there was a positive overall sustained benefit when it comes to existential distress, quality of life, and improved attitude toward death. So this is one that's getting really some legs to it. When a friend of mine is a physician and works with hospice patients, and I talked to her about this. I said, have you heard of these studies and different things? She said, yeah, I'm really curious about these. I'm actually really interested in them because that's one of the biggest things near the end of life, is we feel concern or nervousness and fear, and we can't communicate them with our family about it. And she's very excellent doctor, fantastic. And she said, I have heard of these, I've read about them, I'm curious about them. I think there could be potentially a place in them. How implementation, I don't know. That's the part of it. And then this one I want to take a little time on, MDMA with post-traumatic stress disorder. This was published, this study, and it was very cited. The protocol had 21 people in the original study. It went on from 2003 to 2008. In this study, they really looked at the people who had to participate in the study had to have treatment-resistant PTSD. So in general, they've tried everything, and nothing really worked for them. So those were folks who were able to be a part of this first clinical trial, and it was a range of people, some veterans. There's been a study underway looking at just for veterans and firefighters and police officers. There's definitely there's more and more training going on around this, trying to train people to be facilitators if they are a therapist and they're going to, if this does become a legal option, what do you have to know if you're facilitating one of these sessions? What does that look like? But what was interesting about this study is it got a lot of attention. Rick Doblin, who again is the executive director of MAPS, they met with people at the Pentagon to discuss this study and look at the impacts of post-PTSD, because we know it's a big one. So this was kind of the general conclusion of this study. CAPS stands for Clinician Administered PTSD Scale. It's considered the gold standard for diagnosing PTSD. If you score above 50, you're considered to have pretty severe PTSD. So before treatment, you can see the scores were in the upper 70s. This was a 5-year study. There was a lot of therapy. There was 9 to 10 months of therapy with these specific therapists who were part of the study before they gave you any drug, whether it was MDMA or the placebo. So there's a strong therapeutic alliance, which is very different than going out on a Friday night and taking MDMA. Again, MDMA came from a Schedule I lab, which MDMA, as we know, is one of the most it can be a very adulterated drug. There can be a lot of other drugs cut in with it. But they found after the 5 years that 2 months after the study ended, their average CAP scores were around 30. And about close to, they said, well, maybe that's just because the study ended, so we're going to continue to track the people. And close to 4 years after the study ended, their CAP scores were even lower. So it had a sustained impact. That's incredibly rare, actually, when it comes to PTSD. There's really not much like that. So, and people say, well, how often did they take MDMA in the study? On average, people took it about 3 times over the course of 5 years. That's it. Again, it's not something you can take every day. It's not like a regular pharmaceutical drug. You would have acute tolerance that would build up, and it would have challenges for your serotonergic system in your brain as well if you took it with too much frequency. Even people back in the 70s and 80s said this is something that should be taken no more than once or twice a year, who were advocating for it. So that, I think that's a very interesting one. So this one's fascinating, and that's why people think that MDMA really could be scheduled to Schedule II, because there's a body of evidence building up now with that particular clinical trial being replicated in other countries, replicated in the US, replicated in Canada, Switzerland, and they're finding very similar results to it. So it's gained a little bit of popularity. And why is this? What is behind this drug? What's going on with it? Well, just a quick history. In 1912, it was first synthesized by Merck. They found no use for it and kind of sat on the shelf. This guy, Alexander Shulgin, who you're seeing his picture there, he passed away a few years ago. He was a chemist. He worked for Dow Chemical. Then he got a contract to work for the federal government, and he was able to synthesize different drugs, and they could use them for clinical trials and study, et cetera. And in the 70s, he resynthesized MDMA and started sharing it with some people who he knew who were therapists. He said, there's something about this that I think could be beneficial for people in therapy. And in the 70s, that's how they were using it, usually for trauma, usually for marriage counseling, et cetera. In the early 80s, it kind of got out into the party scene, and it became a drug of abuse, essentially. And then in 1985, the federal government put it on emergency Schedule I, and they said we have to put this on emergency Schedule I, meaning we have about a year to figure out what the permanent schedule it should go in. And it took 3 years. And then in 1988, they said, we're going to make it Schedule 1. And a lot of therapists actually testified at that time in 1985, 86, 87, saying, yep, hey, we don't like the whole party scene with this drug. We think that's a problem. But there is maybe a value to it. And the DEA administrative law judge actually recommended Schedule 3 for MDMA. But the executive director said, no, we're done with this. It's going to be Schedule 1. And then now we have studies approved and underway. So that's kind of how that progression happened. And it got really aligned in the 90s, particularly with the late 80s and throughout the 90s with the rave scene. And part of that is because this drug can encourage a feeling of empathy and connection. And if you're at a large gathering and you're kind of an outcast in the conventional society, and then you're with 2,000 people that are kind of similar to you, and you're taking this thing that makes you feel empathy and connected to them, there was a clear kind of path to why it became popular in those scenes. So that's been the association. And in the 80s, they started calling it ecstasy instead of MDMA, because ecstasy has a better ring to it. And currently you'll hear it often called Molly, because Molly is supposed to mean, it's short for the word molecule, meaning that it's actually pure MDMA. I guarantee you, if we went to I don't know, Champaign, Illinois, and found 10 people that sold us quote unquote Molly, and we took it in a lab, do you think all 10 of those would be pure? No, it's coming in at about 50-60% are adulterated with other drugs. So what happens? Increased heart rate, body blood pressure, body temperature, alertness. Maybe people feel warmth, empathy, compassion for those around them, letting go of aggression, letting go of fear. And in higher doses, though, it can cause nervousness, jaw clenching, jitters, overheating, etc. The other thing with microdosing MDMA, that's one thing we've learned from these clinical trials, microdosing MDMA is actually can cause more anxiety. So it's kind of that 100 to 150 milligrams is recommended, essentially 100, maybe 100 to 140, depending on the size of the person. But that, if you do a small little microdose, it can actually sort of increase anxiety. What's interesting, in a standard dose of MDMA, it's an anxiolytic, meaning it reduces anxiety, but unlike other anxiolytics like Xanax or whatever, where it knocks you out, MDMA is an anxiolytic that stimulates you. So you're very alert, aware, communicative, but it has a strong anxiolytic component to it. So there's really no drug like that in psychiatry. It's very unique, actually. And so that's why during a session for post-traumatic stress disorder, people can, instead of averting from the topic and area that they are feeling anxiety around and stress around, they can look at it, they can approach it, they can discuss it, etc. And it usually doesn't have that same charge where they need to run away from that topic. And then there's a lot of work to be done after a session, right, for integrating it, continued therapy, etc. There's in no way would even anyone doing these clinical trials say it's a one-shot deal and done. Now, with MDMA, because it is so popular with young people, right, they're hearing about these studies, and so their perception of harm, as all of you know, when perception of harm goes down, use can go up. MDMA, the usage of it, or ecstasy, Molly, whatever we want to call it, has maintained popularity for sure, and it's probably even more popular right now. But you're here, and people will often, my last bullet point here, people will feel this really positive effect after, or they feel really depressed and down for days after. And part of that's the context that's set in the setting. If you take it in the morning and you're outside all day and you're talking about stuff in your life, and then you go to bed at a normal time, you might have more of that positive effect. If you go to a rave and you don't sleep all night and you're also using other drugs, and who knows what kind of other drugs are cut in with that, you probably aren't going to feel great, especially if you don't sleep for a couple of days. So some of those externalities play into that, but that perception of harm thing is really important, especially when it comes to this. The problem with MDMA on the street, it is very adulterated. So the biggest thing being cut in with MDMA right now is what's called a synthetic cathinone, or what we call bath salts. So this is a problem, right? The synthetic cathinones, it's kind of terrifying a little bit, right? It's a synthetic drug. It's like almost like a cocaine or methamphetamine, but it's a who knows what the dosage is of it, etc. And we call this in pop culture bath salts, but it could be a very strong stimulant. And then PMA, paramethoxyamphetamine, we don't see that as much, but there has been cases where someone were very slow to metabolize that drug. Someone will take a pill of ecstasy and it has PMA in it, then they'll redose a couple of hours later at a party or a rave or something. And then there was like a case in the UK where 5 people died in the same night and they all had excessive levels of paramethoxyamphetamine in their system. So this is the problem when you get into drug adulteration and this application. Again, this is some of the crux of this session today, is you have students hearing about this stuff, not understanding at all the research protocols, the screening that goes on, the purity. There's nurses and doctors and medical providers and other things on, all kinds of things in place as safety measures, that kind of these guardrails around the research, which is absolutely not the case when you take it outside of that. So one of my biggest fear really with MDMA right now, and this kind of like, oh, it's good for whatever, is the purity levels, and that people can get in real trouble by taking other drugs with it. There's this documentary on YouTube called What's in My Baggie, where these guys go around to music festivals and test people's drugs, and the people will say, oh no, that's totally pure MDMA. I really know the person well who I bought it from. They'll test it and they're like, sorry, this is bath salts. So it's an interesting one. It's kind of more like underground documentary, but it was illuminating. So you're seeing this kind of thing right now where people are talking about drug testing, like testing drugs, especially any white powdery drug, getting a reagent test kit, testing it, seeing what's actually in there. A lot of research was done where people who are drug users said if they did know what was in their drugs, it would affect how they took the drugs, would affect whether or not they took the drugs. This also goes for opioid users with fentanyl. So this is an interesting kind of push toward a harm reduction push toward testing drugs. It's interesting to the point where sometimes at music festivals they'll have a drug test area, and there's sort of this understanding that you might have something illegal, but they're going to test it to make sure it does, especially that it doesn't have fentanyl in it. They are finding, by the way, fentanyl in more cocaine samples and even MDMA samples, not as much as obviously heroin or other opioids, but it's moving its way into the other drug supply. So we have kind of a drug poisoning issue in our society right now as well. Holy cow, that's a lot of information. I'm pretty much wrapped. This is a beautiful picture of the redwoods. Wanted to give that to you. Those are nice to be around sometimes. And in my conclusion, in 2 minutes, then you can ask me all the questions in the world. This guy, Johann Hari, wrote a book about addiction, right? And he did this TED talk, and it's called The Opposite of Addiction is Not Sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Now, he wrote a book called Lost Connections. And this is so relevant to our world right now, especially how everything's digitized because of COVID. And even before COVID, we were all, people were feeling more isolated and lonely and depressed. So I don't know that this sentence is kind of an oversimplification. I don't know that it's exactly just connection, but I think it's a big part of it. I think it's a component of many components. And so that's just in conclusion what I would say. We're in a time, boy, oh boy, do we need this. We need to feel connected with others. And sometimes when that's not there, we try to fill that void with other things, right? So I guess I wanted to just state that. I acknowledge even for this, I can't look at your faces, you can't look at me, or expressions on my face or movements in my body. If I was standing in a room talking with you, it's just a very different dynamic. So I just want to make sure as we progress forward and hopefully move away from where we've been with COVID, that we get back to this level of like, it's okay if we need to connect as people. It is so vital for our health, our mental health, and even the world of addiction. In summary, I have a document that I'm willing to share with everybody. You can freely use it, you can copy it, do whatever you want with it. Over the years, I made this document just from hundreds of conversations with students about what are some questions I can ask students that I think are really pragmatic, non-judgmental, kind of, and you don't have to follow this like a script, but these are just questions that I found interesting. If a student was expressing interest in a drug, instead of just me getting reactive, but just asking about like, hey, what is your motivation? I'm curious, what are the reasons why you want to do this? What's your family history? Are you feeling pressure to use it? Is it internal pressure? Is it from friends? What's the dose you're going to take? Or what about the purity? And have you thought about that? If you're, taking interested in taking MDMA or something to this effect, do you understand the purity or how much you'd be taking? Are there legal consequences potentially? What about the setting? Who will you be with? All those things. And some of these I've found to just be gems, because ultimately I want young people to think critically more. I want adults to think critically more, but I want us all to think critically. So sometimes having questions asked to you where you have to kind of wrestle with it and grapple a little bit, that's okay. That's good. And instead of me just coming out and saying, don't do it or do or whatever, do or don't do it. I'm not right, but let me first ask you some questions, get you thinking through it so that at least you're approaching this with a little more thoughtfulness in general. So if you want this document, I have a nice clean PDF of it. I'm real happy to share as well, and you can distribute it, use it. I do not care at all about the IP on it. Just go for it. One more beautiful picture. This is from Central Oregon. That's my lovely partner, Lydia. We were hiking, backpacking, and this is on the Pacific Crest Trail, and this is a delightful creek to hang out by in the middle of absolute nowhere. So that's what I got for you. That's a lot of information. Hopefully you got something out of that and found some nuggets of information that could be helpful for you or just increase your own knowledge so you feel a little more interested in this topic and empowered around it. So when you're talking to students, you have a little bit different landscape around it. So any questions, thoughts, comments?
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for everyone for attending today's webinar. We have some time to answer some questions now, so if you have any, please type them in the question box on the right. Looks like we have one from a little bit earlier in the presentation, but someone wants to know if MAPS was started by Paul Stamets. I think you might have addressed that at some point in the presentation.
Oh yeah, it was started by Rick Doblin, but Paul Stamets is he's definitely an interesting guy. He's a kind of world famous mycologist. He's a mushroom guy, and he talks about mushrooms ranging from psychedelic mushrooms to mushrooms that can clean up a bioterrorist attack. He's actually, I believe, worked with the federal government on that kind of work. He lives in Washington State. Interesting guy. I've heard him interviewed on Tim Ferriss's podcast and also Joe Rogan's podcast. So he's a very brilliant guy, but no, he did not start MAPS. Other questions or comments even? We like those too.
Yes, we have some other questions. 1 second.
Okay.
So someone else wants to know, are there any approved psychedelic therapies in practice in other countries?
Yes, there are ibogaine clinics in a couple countries, Netherlands, Mexico. There are approved psilocybin in a couple European countries. Gosh, I would be lying if I knew which countries those were offhand. I believe the Netherlands is one, but there's a couple more where psilocybin's approved. Ketamine is another one, which is, and I don't know if it's a true psychedelic or more of a dissociative psychedelic. Even MDMA, I don't know if it can be categorized as it's not categorized as a classical psychedelic because it has a little bit of the opposite effects on the brain, but kind of as well. But ketamine is what interesting one that is kind of mixed outcomes, and there's a ketamine clinics all over actually in the US right now. So that's kind of an interesting little trend that's going on. So you'll see some of that in other countries as well. Yeah, and then I believe in like Romania, there's a few kind of obscure Eastern European countries where I know like 5-MeO DMT is legal and people sometimes go there for those types of sessions. Um, but so there's a little bit of it out there, but not too much, not too much.
All right, we've got some other comments talking about how helpful and useful all the information is, so
All
that's
right.
always good. And
Yeah.
then one more question, it looks like, what suggestions do you have for resources to link on a website for students to explore the material on their own time?
Yeah. I think the map site is actually a pretty good one because it is very science based. It's very much on what is going on with the research. Some of the stuff they're going to see on pop culture, especially like the Netflix one that you have all these comedians that they probably like. It's a lot of like kind of hip comedians talking about psychedelics in a mostly positive light. That stuff is like kind of just swinging them in a different way. But yeah, I think the maps is a really, I think, a good place to start. And again, that could be where they can see then if they actually are willing to take the time to understand the methodology on the research, then they can see, oh, okay, yeah, this is nothing like doing this to party or in a party environment. So I would have them start there. Um, Gosh, I've just read, I mean, it's hard because I've read so much stuff over the years. There's books that I've read. I mean, another website, which is interesting one, is erowid.org, but your students who are interested in drugs, I guarantee you know about that site. It's EROWID.org. That is a very, I always talk about, again, confirmation bias with my students. I said, the bias of this website, you tell me. I have them look at it and they're like, oh, it's anti-drug war, but they want people to have accurate information about drugs. I've said pretty much that's it. So you're going to see real critiques of drug policy, but I think some of the actual pharmacological information they have is pretty good on that site. But then there is a link to like user reports, and sometimes that's where it gets a little weird because some of the user reports, they're like glowing and this changed my life, and then but then other ones are really negative and say this was dangerous, and like I had a really negative experience with this and here's what happened and please be careful. So it's a site that a lot of students who are kind of curious on these topics already know about, but it's kind of an interesting one, especially for you all, if you just want to know more about a specific drug, like especially all these synthetics that are coming out now, these kind of abstract synthetics. You can go into what's called like a vault, right? So you go into the 5-MeO DMT vault and read about the drug with more detail, so it gives you some understanding. If a student mentions a certain compound to you and you don't know what it is, because there's a ton of synthetics now, that's where we're in this kind of wild west with the synthetics as well. So I think those are the maps one. Again, I think is a really interesting one, and just continually talking to them about the importance of the distinction between clinical trials that are approved by the clearly approved by multiple agencies versus taking something on one's own, without really understanding of it. So, but it is, again, that confluence is there, that where it's the research and the pop culture raising this kind of exposure and awareness, and then trickling down into perception of harm being lowered, I think is a very real thing right now. So have that discussion with them, with students, openly talk about it, and ask what they know about it or what they're reading too.
All right, and then kind of on the thing of synthetic compounds, in one of the studies you mentioned, you said that they use synthetic psilocybin instead of like the natural source,
Yes.
despite the natural source having synthetic or synergistic compounds in it.
Yeah.
Is there any certain reason why they do that?
They want it for standardization. So they want to make sure that they know in that clinical trial they can have a very specific dose, in a with a very specific application. So anybody in kind of the pharmaceutical world or even supplement world, standardization is a pretty important concept. And so that's kind of the one trick when you have a natural product. um, Having that be standardized is really tricky. So we see that even with, like, an example of that is cannabis. There's something called trichomes on the cannabis plant that you look at them under a microscope when they're kind of mostly cloudy, that the THC is at its peak level. When those trichomes have become more amber color, the THC is actually diminishing And another cannabinoid, CBN, is becoming more prominent, and that cannabinoid is more sedating. So it's interesting. You can have the same plant, but depending when you harvested it, the user experience is going to be really different. So that's where it becomes tricky. When you have a natural product like that, getting real standardization is difficult. So I will be curious what they're going to do. Like, I think Oregon will be kind of the test ground for this, where they're going to say, okay, we're, I thought about actually applying to be on that committee to make the administrative rules for this law, but I missed the deadline and was kind of busy. But I really kind of regret that now. But there's all kinds of agencies and people on that committee. But I'll be really curious what they come up with. How will they approve this in a way that they can have some level of standardization, even though it's a natural product that's going to have all these little nuances and differences to each individual mushroom. And so that's really, Clay, the primary reason why they, in the studies so far at least, have used synthetic psilocybin, just so they can kind of know what they're giving everybody the same thing. Yeah.
All right, it looks like we've got one last question. It says, how did you get into this field?
I've all my major in school was education, health education, health, and then my a kind of minor that I wrote myself, like a mix of family studies, human development, and human sexuality. And then I started right away. I taught a little bit in middle school, and then right away I had a professor ask me to be his GA, and I got back into I went back to school even though I wasn't quite ready, and really fell in love with working in the college environment. So I started teaching at a pretty young age because as his GA I had my own classes, and then I just did my master's, and I did my master's in health promotion and program management. And so I started doing being a generalist health educator on campus, but also really loving that connection to teaching. So I had both of those roles, a dual appointment throughout my, time. And one of the classes I was tasked to teach was about drugs, and from an early point on. And I felt like I need to really understand this. This is a complex topic, and I don't want to be intimidated by it. So I'm going to just dive in all domains. And I found that when I talk to people in a really open-minded way, whether they're users or not, or against it or for whatever, they're very open. And so it's encouraged me to understand people's personal stories. Um, and then a lot of the work I was doing when I actually lived in Wisconsin was around alcohol education, because it's a big issue there. I worked at UW La Crosse for a number of years, and so that kind of got me interested in the whole topic of substance use in general, and then just really found it to be something that I liked working with, and then getting to know people in different clinical fields and addiction fields and all of it. So I just something I found interesting, and you know, there's a little bit of family history there, just in my own family. Both grandfathers having real challenges with alcohol, and just seeing impacts in my own family. It got me curious as well. Um, so yeah, that was kind of it, and I just felt like, wow, what a topic that I can approach and find meaning with, and yeah, and be honest with students and connect with them about as well. So that's kind of how it happened. Yeah.
Alrighty, well, if no one has any other questions, let's just all thank Matt again for a wonderful presentation. And just a reminder to please keep an eye out for an email from GoToWebinar. Will come about an hour after the program ends. The email will have a link to fill out our evaluation. This evaluation will help us keep up with planning for future events, and certificates will be issued within 7 to 10 business days from the webinar, and we will have the webinar available on the IHEC website. Thank you.
Hey, Clay, real quick, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, if I want to give out, like, if anyone wants that PDF of those questions or any other resources from me, I don't know, Clay, when you send that out, could you send out my email with it? Or I don't know, it's on the first slide actually. Um, Here, I'm gonna go to the first slide. So if people want it, there's my email right there. Oh gosh, sorry. There's my email right there at the bottom, and there's a website that I have too, which I need to update. I haven't put anything on there in the last 8 months, but there is my email. So you feel free to reach out to me directly, and I can connect with you and get you some resources, that PDF or whatever else. So yeah.
All
Okay,
right. Anything else we want to add?
I think that's it.
All righty. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.